Thanks for having us up here. I know we know a lot of you, and we love this board, it's an incredible turnout today. This membership meeting is incredible. Yeah. Okay, so to answer the question, because I know you are all gripped at the edge of your seat, I feel like I'm at a town hall here. I didn't know I was running for president. Should I announce my candidacy? Hi, Frank. I see Frank in the front row. Okay, so the question, there are discount brokers who are offering to list homes and put them in the MLS with no other services rendered for a small flat fee. How is that legal with the state's requirements of minimal duties? It's not, okay? It's not. The state, the Indiana code, requires minimum duties to be performed by a real estate agent. You have to be available to submit offers, counter offers, and complete that transaction to a signed purchase agreement. And then you are still supposed to stay involved until all the contingencies are satisfied or waived. So you cannot just enter a property into the MLS and say, I'm done. That's under Indiana law and Indiana code, that is not sufficient.
Thank you. Next question, if a buyer closes with the seller and allows the seller, say, 15 days to move out after closing, and the home burns down in that time, the good old what-if questions, will insurance cover the buyer on the house even if they did not have renter insurance?
Yeah, I'm going to take that one. I will start off by saying that as long as I've worked the legal hotline, I can tell you that anytime there is a the sellers are in possession after closing, that's when everything's going to go wrong. It happens every time. So they have 15 days to stay in the house after they move out and the house burns down. And this has happened. We have it in the contract because it's happened. And there's a section in the purchase agreement under the possession section that says actually what at the time of the closing, buyer has to have homeowner's insurance at the time they close. And that's what will take over if there is an actual issue with the home, like if it were to burn down. So the renter's insurance, that would then become the seller's obligation once they close, if they want to have renter's insurance on their personal property. But the home itself would be covered under the homeowner's policy that the buyer has when it closes. And again, check the possession section. It even talks about, I think, who pays the what the options are at that point and who pays the deductible and things like that.
Okay, thank you. Next question, if a house has standing water in the yard and is not disclosed, does that fall under the moisture problems in crawl, basement, or other section?
Only if that is causing moisture problems in the crawl, the basement, or any other part of the house. I can tell you personally, when it rains a lot, I have water that stands in some part of my yard. Does not affect my house, doesn't affect the structure of my house. So it really depends on the facts of the case. If there's standing water and that is causing moisture problems, then you would have to disclose that on the seller disclosure form.
Thank you. A buyer buys a home, and the day after taking possession, the furnace is not working. The seller claims it worked fine, and the inspection found no problem. Is it the buyer's problem or the seller's?
This is another thing that happens all the time. And I would say it depends. This answer depends on when the problem occurred. If the problem occurred prior to closing, that's still going to be an issue for the seller to take care of. Unfortunately, most buyers wouldn't know about that. They need to do a final walkthrough just before closing, and everything needs to be checked out. That's when they'll find out if they forego the walkthrough and they go to closing and then they get to the property. They're going to have to be able to prove that whatever was wrong with the the water heater? Furnace. Whatever was wrong with it occurred prior to the closing, and that's going to be pretty hard for them to prove. So I would encourage the walkthroughs.
Excellent point. Buyers sometimes ask us why we're suggesting those. Now we have a reminder. Okay, the buyer switched financing without notifying the seller and getting the offer amended. Are they in breach of contract? Can the seller void the offer and accept another one that is pursuing the type of financing the seller agreed to? Does the seller have to wait until the first offer expires to go with another offer, or can they void the first offer due to the buyer changing terms the seller did not agree to? That's about 4 questions in one. Kelly's doing that one.
Yeah, I'll do that. These are actually the exact questions we get on the hotline every day. And like all the other questions we have, everything always depends. The buyer switched financing without notifying the seller and offering or amending the contract. There is a reason why buyers have to declare in the purchase agreement the type of financing that they're going to be getting. Some financings do have an effect on the seller, like they may have to pay some of the costs involved or something like that. So there is a reason for that. If a buyer were to change their type of financing during the transaction and not to the seller, whether or not that's going to be a problem depends on whether or not it does affect the seller. So if they started out with one type of financing, seller was going to incur no costs or anything like that, being the seller, and then all of a sudden they switched to, let's say, VA, just because that's the one that I think has some costs involved for a seller, then there is going to be, that could be a problem. And that would be, when I say a problem, that's going to bring up issues that would cause them to need to change the contract or get the seller's agreement. So that'll depend on which type of financing. And it also will, whether the seller can void the offer and accept another one, would depend on if it's causing the buyer to not make their financing deadline. That does give the seller, once a buyer does not make the financing deadline, then the seller may terminate at that point. So that may cause that, it might lead to it, but it doesn't mean the seller automatically gets to cancel that contract right up front. Does the seller have to wait until the first offer expires to go on with another offer? They always, anytime you're in a contract, a purchase agreement, the parties can either terminate or the contract will expire. The expiration date would be at the end of the contract where it says it shall close by blank date or it'll terminate. So you either have to have a mutual agreement signed by the parties or the contract terminates before there's no longer a contract. So you have to have one or the other. I don't know if we've gotten all these or not. So they should never go on to another offer before either the purchase agreement's either terminated by way of mutual release or it expires.
Okay, that was a multi-level.
I must have missed
Just
something.
add, no, she actually covered everything, but I just was thinking. So, I mean, if you're switching financing from a 15-year to a 30-year or an adjustable rate to a fixed rate, that's not going to change the terms. There's no prejudice to the seller. You're not going to be able to void a contract even if you want to under those circumstances. Should you have an amendment? Yes, but in those circumstances, I think Kelly and I both agree, that court's not going to let you out of that contract if it doesn't provide some prejudice to that seller or some effect to that seller, okay?
Good point, thank you. On to escalation clauses. If the buyer submits an escalation clause and it is exercised by the seller to a new adjusted price, and the seller then counters the offer with final terms at the new escalated price, can the buyer reject the counter even though it fits in the window they agreed to offer up to? And wouldn't it be better to have the seller accept the offer with an escalation clause and then send back an amendment finalizing terms that the buyer would need to sign rather than a counteroffer?
These are great questions. How many people use the escalation clause? It's amazing, especially in this hot market. I imagine it's being used a lot more. And we put that escalation clause in there because people were writing in these conditions and we were afraid for liability purposes. We wanted to make sure they covered certain terms. You can have a cap on it. But in terms of the question, can the buyer reject the counter? There's no legally binding contract until that counter goes back with the escalated price and the buyer signs and agrees to it. So legally, you don't have a contract until the buyer agrees. Most of the time, I haven't seen that happen very often. They want the property. So when you come back with the price that they've agreed to, they're going to accept it. It doesn't matter if it's an amendment or a counteroffer. An amendment, you're still gonna have to agree to that escalated price by the buyer. So counteroffer is what's indicated in our form, our escalation clause form. If you wanted to send an amendment back that said, hey, this is the escalated price, and the buyer signs that, there's still a binding agreement there. Okay? Hopefully I've answered most of those questions. Sometimes you can have dueling escalation clauses. It can get kind of tricky, but it's always a good idea to put a cap in there so you're not paying more. You also have to realize there's gonna be a financing issue. You know, if you go too high, it might not appraise and the party's gonna be able to back out anyway. Okay?
I'm gonna take privilege and add one more question onto that. The escalation clause talks about the dollars being based on net dollars to the seller. Do you get many calls asking about net versus sales price on those? Yeah.
I've had calls where unfortunately brokers haven't seen that little word net and they failed to account for that. So yeah, they need to be careful with that.
Okay. Watch your language on the escalation clauses for sure.